everybody to put themselves on mute. Two ground rules. First of all, welcome to today's IEO's webinar. Let's not return to normal, building a prosperous post-growth economy with Tim Jackson, Simon Johnson, and Prakash Loungani. I would like to just give a couple of ground rules, which is keep yourself on mute. I can mute too, so do it yourself before I do it, because we can hear often some noises in the background. If you have questions or comments, there'll be plenty of time for that, but you can always preempt the Q&A session by also typing your questions in the chat so that we create like a little queue of questions. The webinar today will focus on Professor Tim Jackson's new book, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. Tim Jackson is a British ecological economist and professor of sustainable development at the University of Surrey. He's the director of the Center for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, a multidisciplinary international research consortium which aims to understand the economic, social, and political dimensions of sustainable prosperity. He is the author of Prosperity Without Growth, which first came out in 2010, with the second edition in 2017, a book described by Le Monde as one of the most outstanding pieces of work in environmental economics. His most recent book, Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism, was published in March 2021, just recently, by Policy Press. Professor Simon Johnson, MIT's Sloan School of Management and ex-IMF chief economist, and Prakash Loungani, assistant director of the IEO, will join us as well with thoughts and reactions about Tim's book. Thank you all for being here. We are honored to have you here, Tim, and I would like to go straight into it. After your bestseller, Prosperity Without Growth, another eloquent book on the subject of post-growth. So I first read Prosperity Without Growth, of course, which fascinated me, and the second edition, which also touches upon, more recent stuff. How would you describe this new work relative to that, and what pushed you to write more on this topic?
Thanks, Nicoletta. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here. Post-growth is both a sequel to Prosperity Without Growth and also in some senses a prequel. Prosperity Without Growth was a very specific document. It was kind of written for the British government at the time that it was written. It was very much a policy document, and it set out many of the rational arguments around the potential limits to growth, the trade-offs that one had to think about when you were thinking about growth and environment, the dilemma of growth as I situated it there, which is that even though a continually expanding economy doesn't really work that well on a finite planet, the idea of contracting the economy doesn't really sit that well with our conventional understandings of economics and society. It was a policy book. It was a more intellectual book, and actually the audience for whom it was written, and I'm sure they would agree if they were on the call, weren't absolutely overwhelmed to receive that document in their in trays. It was a document to the government, but it was a government that at that point was struggling with the aftermath of the financial crisis, which had many other demands on its time, and wasn't quite prepared to listen to troublesome advisors talking about prosperity without growth. And what happened subsequently, I think, was that Prosperity Without Growth found, to me, what was an extraordinary and very, very wide audience. It was humbling in many respects to have kind of written this document, presented it as if to government, and then found that everybody from the usual suspects, let's say environmental activists, to libraries, town hall meetings, theatres, drama clubs, And financial institutions, and some quite big financial institutions, were interested in talking about this theme. In other words, it was a much wider theme than perhaps it had been given credit for up to that point, and it was something that was of profound interest to everybody. And in a sense, part of writing post-growth was actually to write a book for that very much wider audience, for people who didn't read policy documents, who weren't that interested in graphs. And I count my own mother in that. She said, when Prosperity Without Growth came out, she said, it looks lovely, Tim, but there's lots of graphs in it, and I don't do too well with those. And that's probably true for quite a lot of people, even though the subject matter, this issue around the kind of economy that we have, the kind of society we want, and the way in which that is or isn't in conflict with the planet we live on, that is a theme that is and should be of interest to everybody. And that's kind of a part of what I was doing in writing post-growth, was to make those arguments broader, to give them depth, to give them historical situation and context, to give them stories, to tell the stories of people whose ideas inform the possibility of life after capitalism, and to do it in a way that hopefully is readable, not just by people in number 10 sitting waiting for policy reports. So that's kind of what I was trying to do.
Yes, I found, I mean, the two books intertwine to some extent. I mean, there are many points of context, but I can see how, you in post growth, it takes almost another dimension, which is that even widening, that audience, bring in testimony, as you said, on some of the subjects, and particularly like the aspects on, the COVID considerations, and the fact that it's really timely as well with what's going on. Now, turning to COVID, which is, the subject of the last 2 years. COVID clearly gave a big blow to economic growth globally. In April last year, for 2020, the IMF projected global growth to hit the record low of about -5%. And now in 2021, it seems we're on the cusp of a boom, although this, of course, largely is a base effect, the fact that we went so low. Even before COVID, things in the growth department weren't too rosy, and I think you put it very well in your books, in the last book as well. Can you give us a 360 panel on what's going on, as you do in your book? What's going on with growth globally? Why we're struggling to replicate the rates of growth that we have been accustomed to have in the past? And what are the underlying causes of this global economic anemia, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, that to me was a kind of starting point. That obviously the pandemic struck in the middle of me writing the book, and it gave a completely different context to everything that I was writing about, in a sense. And it's something, obviously, I would imagine that we'll talk about a little bit. But the pre-pandemic context was already one in which the conventional model of growth was not as vigorous, let's say, as economists mostly and politicians almost ubiquitously hoped that it would be. And the reality is it hadn't been for some time. Many people would talk about the overhang after the financial crisis, and to some extent the kind of anemic growth rates, particularly in advanced economies, as being a part of headwinds, if you like, against the return to growth that followed on after the financial crisis. I think that analysis is interesting, but I don't think it's complete. And the argument that I make in the book actually is that when you look at growth rates in the longer term, you find essentially, if you take an advanced economy like the UK or the US, you find an increase in the growth of labor productivity from about the beginning of the 19th century, or the beginning of the 20th century, end of 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, until about the middle of the 20th century. So 1960, 65, 70 tends to be the peak of labor productivity growth rates. And after that point, actually, we've seen quite a steady decline in labor productivity growth in the advanced economies. It's quite well documented. It's documented across the OECD countries. countries. It exists to some extent in some of the industrializing countries, but the decline in the level of the growth rate is nothing like so severe as it is in the advanced economies. But the advanced economies have been looking at that underlying decline in labor productivity growth from about the middle of the 20th century. And to me, that has colored the situation in relation both to the economic possibilities in advanced economies and to the social conditions in those advanced economies and to the political response to a declining labor productivity growth rate. And it's a very uncomfortable position for capitalism to be in, because essentially when labor productivity is growing fast, you can cut your labor costs and that will increase your margins, and increasing your margins allows you to pay your workers more, or to pay your shareholders more, or to invest more in the future. When labor productivity growth begins to slow, all of those things get squeezed quite substantially, and then you find yourself in a kind of battle between workers on the one hand, the owners of capital on the other hand, and the future, which is our investment possibilities. And a lot depends on how you deal with that situation. And my argument in the book is that actually the advanced economies dealt with it in a very particular way by favoring the owners of capital over both workers and investments in the real productivity in the future, and thereby exacerbated the situation, created social inequality, and eventually that led to the financial instability that became the financial crisis. In other words, I'm saying that what we're looking at, and what we were looking at even before the pandemic, was a situation in which capitalism itself was running into the buffers, in which it was not able to produce the kinds of labor productivity growth that had characterized its heyday back in the 1960s and 1970s. And that, it seems to me, is, it's a slightly different argument from the argument about limits to growth informed by climate change or the finite boundaries of the planet. It's an argument that comes right from inside capitalism itself, right from inside the existing economic system. When you begin to see the deficiencies of the last few decades in its light, it means that we really should be thinking about that situation in structural terms right now, if not several decades ago, and beginning to think about what a post-growth economy means, because that seems to be the direction in which the underlying economic statistics show us we are already heading.
Yes.
Did you want me to say a little bit more about, and then came the pandemic, because we could clearly talk about that as well, Nicoletta.
Maybe, yeah. I am not planning to. I see this more of like a continuum of events.
Sure.
Of course, the pandemic took a tremendous toll, but it didn't cure those structural issues. If anything, aggravated them. So maybe, yeah. Why don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it did. I did a number of things. I mean, obviously, the events of the last year have been quite extraordinary outside the experience of anybody on the call or even previous generations for quite some time. So we're not in a situation that we know about. We're not in a situation that we know how to handle. We're not in a situation where there is any rule book. And I think it did. It did a couple of things very, very clearly. First of all, it showed for us, what our priorities are as a society, and that at the end of the day, all of this talk about growth and all of the talk about wealth is not really what prosperity is concerned with. Above all and before everything, prosperity is concerned with health. And actually, in protecting health, we sometimes have to make decisions not to protect wealth. And those kinds of decisions were, at least in some places, decisions that were taken early on during the pandemic to protect life, to shore up health systems, to strengthen our hospitals, to build hospitals sometimes overnight, to do what was necessary to protect the health of the population, and in doing so to protect prosperity itself. So that was a very profound lesson that we learned from that period. And we also learned exactly actually how much governments could do, how fast they could do it, how many tools there were in the toolbox, at least in the short term, to protect people's livelihoods, to intervene in supply chains, to create create the momentum that was needed to protect lives in the economy and indeed to stabilize livelihoods during the pandemic. All of those things, I think, are lessons that we should take with us as we design a post-pandemic recovery. And then I think, you know, there are also lessons around, and I think we at the moment we stand at a point of decision about how we come back, where the post-pandemic recovery comes from. And I think, you know, in answer to your question about, yeah, it looks like we might get some kind of bounce back, which is probably about, you know, the base level that we're starting from and the fact that we had a sharp retrenchment. But broadly speaking, I think I see kind of three responses around. One is that we should do everything we can to encourage that bounce back as fast as we can, because growth is what matters. Let's call that, for want of a better word, a kind of pro-growth position. The second is a slightly more nuanced position, which includes the idea that actually at this point in time, if we're looking at stimulating our economies, one place to stimulate it would be in the transition to net zero, so to invest in the things that will give us a fast transition to net zero, a kind of, you know, a green growth position, if you like, with a hope that that trajectory will also bring back growth in the way that we have had it before. And I think there is a third position, which is in some sense the position I'm talking about in the book, defending in the book, and I think is an important position to take, because it draws so heavily from the lessons of the crisis, namely that actually it is well-being, it is health, it is sustainability in the long term. These are the components of prosperity, and sometimes protecting these things is not the same thing as driving growth forward. Sometimes actually we need to listen to those lessons from the pandemic and the lessons from the long term, and begin to protect those livelihoods of the people who were and remain the most valuable in society. So this would be, if you like, a prosperity as health scenario. This would be my third option. It would be arguing, in fact, that the economy, and an economy that delivers prosperity, is an economy of care, in which actually it's the professions that provide for our basic physical sustenance, that care for our lives, that look after our children, that look after our elderly people, that create quality of life, that craft beautiful things, and that deliver the creativity that makes life worth living. These professions, actually, the ones that had been so hard done by capitalism, emerged during the pandemic as the most important ones that we could focus on. And I think, in a way, what I'm trying to do is create the very real possibility that is a scenario that is available to us right now, precisely because of the crisis that we've been through.
Yes, I think certainly we shouldn't waste this crisis, and there are lots of lessons, including on the goals. I want to take you here on a subject that interests us. I mean, we're the IEO, independent of fund management, but the seminar, it has many IMF staff. We're now really in the IMF den, and in fact, we invited Simon Johnson, who in 2008 was the fund chief economist, and so he will, I'm sure, express some of the views that he garnered from his experience. Now, the fund mandate specifically demands the IMF to work to ensure financial and macroeconomic stability. It's in the article of the agreement, and that is usually equated to strong and balanced growth. It is equated. I mean, stability doesn't necessarily mean growth, but it's equated. And after the global financial crisis, the growth of the Group of 20 came up with a mantra, like a slogan. It was the strong, sustainable, and balanced. And the adjective sustainable, I think it didn't really have as much to do with the greenness of growth, but more with the durability of growth. do you think that equating growth with the fund mandate, or otherwise equating the fund mandate as it's worded with the concept of perennial economic growth globally is a reasonable translation of that mandate? And perhaps even more existentially, is this, in your view, a reasonable goal for macroeconomic stability at all beyond the IMF? This seems to be the focus of your book, so I'm sure you've thought of that.
So thanks, Nicoletta. Let's take the yes. I like the idea that I'm in the den somehow. It's a almost biblical metaphor, I suspect, in some respects. But let's try and see how far we go with that challenge. I mean, I guess you won't be that surprised to hear me say that my answer is no. That I don't think that either in macroeconomic terms or in ecological terms, or even in social terms, that a single-handed mandate which has an undifferentiated, basically an undifferentiated growth path into the future is a reasonable aim for an organization whose fundamental being is around creating stability. And to some extent, you could say, well, that's only financial or it's macroeconomic stability. But actually, I think macroeconomic stability and financial stability go together with social sustainability and social stability. I don't think you can tease them apart. I think that's what the mandate, as it exists at the moment, as it's framed at the moment, as it's been prosecuted for most of the last half century, I don't think is sufficient for the place that we are at the moment, for all sorts of reasons. First of all, because it doesn't differentiate between advanced economies and the growth path that they may or may not be on, and the more emerging economies and the demands that they have as countries. It doesn't differentiate between strong, sustainable, balanced growth in macroeconomic terms and sustainable, balanced growth in ecological terms. It doesn't even really address the fundamental question that I raised right at the beginning, which is that under declining fundamentals, the pursuit of growth can be a destabilizing aspect of the economy, and I would argue was a destabilizing aspect of the economy in the run-up to the financial crisis. So it does seem to me that if you take any of those things seriously, then you have to have a kind of more differentiated mandate. And I think now is the time to be thinking about that as we're coming out of the pandemic, as we're thinking about what is needed to not just stabilize in financial terms, but to stabilize in social terms, to stabilize in ecological terms. Those things must all, it seems to me, be a part of the mandate of the IMF.
So you also have the first book is almost summarized in a 2018 paper, academic paper that you published, and there you kind of gloss over a little bit this issue, I think, of differentiation. You touch upon it, but you don't dive into it like you do in the books. But the answer, the immediate gut reaction would be, well, but growth, there are lots of countries that are way behind, and they need to grow to fill that gap, to arrive and to enjoy the welfare that we in advanced economies have been enjoying now for decades. I mean, nobody has the right to stop them from doing that, and that should be their goal. So how does this idea of stability as non-translatable simply into growth come to be for those countries, and how should maybe the IMF think about this differentiation that you were just mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point, a really good challenge. I mean, that 2018 paper that you mentioned, interestingly, was commissioned by the Ministry of Defence in the UK as a background paper to a long-term risk report. So it was it's very specifically looking at the UK context and at the context of developed economies as they face a sort of secular stagnation or the possibility of secular stagnation into the future. And And it was interesting for all sorts of reasons, not the least of which was that here was an advanced economy prepared to think potentially about the implications of its own long-term growth path in a different way than it had done in the past. But it didn't, and you're right about this, it didn't really address the issue of growth in developing countries. And I did do that, particularly in Prosperity Without Growth. And I did a lot of actually evidence gathering in relation to that. And what comes out of that evidence gathering very clearly is that the conditions of life improve very fast in the poorest countries in the world as you increase income in those countries. In other words, that's the point at which growth is much, much better aligned with prosperity than it is in the advanced economies. And that relationship holds from about zero income to around about $20,000 per capita a year income levels. And during that increase of income from nothing to around about $25,000 per capita, all kinds of prosperity outcomes increase massively. So you get longer life expectancy, you get lower infant mortality, you get lower maternal morbidity, you get better participation in education, you even get better happiness as measured by reported life satisfaction surveys, whether you count those as anything or not. You see all of these dividends from having better, more secure incomes very, very fast at low income levels. And then at a certain point in time, those trends change, and they change dramatically. And in fact, the diminishing returns to income growth hit in after around about $20,000 per capita and create what is more or less a straight line and sometimes a downward turned line in that prosperity versus income equation. And so you get some real anomalies, like the fact that the US, the UK, and Ireland, for example, have lower life expectancy than Costa Rica, Cuba, and Chile in the sort of sweet spot of prosperity in relation to life expectancy. In other words, that differentiation should guide us. It should tell us not that we get on a soapbox and tell countries who haven't developed that they can't afford anymore because we've trashed the planet, but rather that that's the place where income growth matters. And what has to happen, and is a responsibility of the advanced economies, is to develop a model for themselves that is essentially a post-growth model. And it's that post-growth model that allows for the space, the ecological space, which actually the poorest people in the world not only desire, but deserve. And I think that's a really important part of the differentiation that you were talking about.
I want to spend have a couple questions, and then I'm going to move to Simon and Prakash. But I want to talk about the theory of this, the conceptual part of this a little bit. From a conceptual point of view, there are people, of course, that think that we can grow forever because our imagination ability to innovate is boundless. And in the book Pause Growth, you mentioned the famous speech by Ronald Reagan, but also of a peer of us, the Nobel laureate in economics, Professor Paul Krugman. And indeed, for all means and purposes, the professions workhorse model remains the solo swan 1956 neoclassical growth model, where growth is driven by supply side factors. You mentioned this: labor, man-made capital, and technology. But while in that model, labor and capital are limited, according to the theory, the contribution from technology to growth is boundless, and thus potentially growth itself is boundless. And you hear it a lot when people talk about innovating ourselves out of climate change crisis or biodiversity crisis. We can innovate, we can find ways, new technologies that are going to save us, right? And in fact, respecting this doctrine, consideration about climate change have altered the solo swan model only marginally. And on the other hand, leading Earth system scientists like Johan Rockström and Will Steffen study the resilience of ecosystems across the globe and found that there are boundaries, planetary boundaries, hardwired into the Earth's environment. If we push our aggregate demand to such an extent that any one of these boundaries is breached, they claim, risk destabilizing our life support system, which of course includes the economy, which are part of it, or a tiny part of it. So the question is, who should we believe, and can we square this circle? This very high standard scientists of different disciplines.
Yeah, I honestly think, Nicholas, I cannot really sit and listen to someone saying that, I know you're not saying this, but anybody who really thinks that, we don't have to do any better in terms of the solo growth model at this point in time, when we know what we know about the dependencies of those factors of production, and indeed of knowledge itself, on the finite materials of the planet, on the integrity of the climate of the planet, on the impact on other species on the planet, that those are limits that will denude our quality of life, denigrate our planet, and make future generations, within a matter of decades, if any of Johan Rockström or Will Steffen's work is to be believed, if any of the IPCC's work is to be believed, that not factoring those things into the way that we think about our growth model is disastrous for the future. So I would say, in a sense, that's a more than overdue reconsideration of how growth models work and their dependency on the natural world, at the very least. And the people that I know who've done that work, including people like Bob Ayres and Steve Keen, for example, once you do start factoring those resources into your growth model, you find very quickly, actually, that historical evidence suggests that quite a large part of our growth is down to precisely those ways in which we have used and abused the natural world. So it doesn't give us any confidence that that's the kind of growth model that we can rely on going forwards. If we look at the possibilities for technological efficiency, I'm the first person to admit that they exist. I spent the first 10 years of my life working exactly on those ideas, working in particular around efficiency, material efficiency, renewable energy, all of those things which can help us as technologies. And sometimes, yes, they sometimes do give us a kind of boost in productivity that will allow us to see a little bit of growth in the future. But none of them is delivering with sufficient speed to meet the challenges that we now face. And that's exactly, I think, where the planetary boundaries work comes in, where Johann's work and Steffen's work comes in, because it says, basically, these are non-linear processes. They exist as boundaries. Once you cross those boundaries and thresholds, you're not in a position of linear adjustment. You're in a position of collapse. And in the face of that, we don't actually, at this point in time, have economic models that will tell us anything about growth possibilities as we confront those boundaries. So it does seem to me, incredibly important to think differently. And you started your question with this, and I do want to comment on it a little bit, about limits themselves and our own aversion to the idea of limits, almost, and particular aversion that economics has to the idea of limits, because it wants to convert all questions of limits into questions of price. And that doesn't really address these non-linearities. It doesn't address irreversibilities. It doesn't address tipping points. It doesn't address the kinds of things, in fact, that the Club of Rome was pointing to even as long ago as 1972, when Ronald Reagan, in response to it, turned around and said, no, there's no limits, because there's no limits to our ingenuity. It's a kind of, to me, it's a kind of, it's a hubris, it's an arrogance that would be our downfall if we took it too seriously, the idea that we can tech fix our way out of any limit to growth whatsoever. And that was one of the parts of the book. One of the most important points of post-growth, in a way, was to explore this kind of aversion that we have to limits, and to see if we could frame that idea of limits in a different way, to distinguish between what is limited. For example, like the limited carbon budget that we can afford if we want to remain within 1.5 or 2 degrees over the next 10 years, and what is unlimited. And I do believe that there are unlimited aspects to human society. I think we can think in unlimited ways about social progress. I think we can think in unlimited ways about our own creativity. We can think in unlimited ways about our relationships with other people, about the extent of our concern for other people. We can think in unlimited ways about our poetry, about our sense of meaning and purpose in life. And our job within economics, and it seems to be a very fundamentally economic challenge, is to distinguish between what is limited and what is unlimited, and give space to what is unlimited as we begin to stay within the bounds of what is limited. And that was, that as a vision, as a guiding principle for economics, and as a response to the challenge of not having a legitimate growth model at this point in time, I think is a profoundly important place of reflection.
I have one last question because I don't want to miss on this, and then I'm going to pass the baton to Professor Johnson. So, in the light of all this, your books, your work, your witness, do you have any recipes for the IMF? What would be the one thing people should come away, people from the IMF, listen to this seminar, and other economists that are engaged into, get us all to a safer place? What are the implications of your analysis for economic advisors and politicians, like this in simple terms?
I mean, I think, thank you. I think that is a difficult place, the difficult thing to do in the den, but obviously one that's absolutely called for. So let me kind of sort of put it a little bit like this, I guess, that it seems to me that that the IMF plays a central role. It has to play a central role in the future. That's kind of point one. The idea of a fund that can support differentially across the world and can pursue prosperity even in those places where it has begun to fall apart is incredibly important. And I've always emphasized this, both in Prosperity Without Growth and in Post-Growth, that economic relationships matter. There's a lot of my students, a lot of young people actually don't want anything to do with economics because they actually see it as having been corrupted and having been almost literally bankrupt, both by the financial crisis and by the inequality that they see around the world, and now possibly in terms of its response to the pandemic. What I try to teach my students is that actually economics is fundamentally important because it embodies absolutely critical relationships between ourselves within society and between society and the natural world, and that we have to reframe our economics to make sense of those relationships. And one of the key relationships always for me has been the relationship of investment. The idea of money as a fund that flows and protects ourselves, the idea of money that flows as a fund and invests in ourselves and our children, but in particular the idea of investment itself as a commitment to the future. And the purpose of this reframing, which might seem a purely cosmetic exercise. Why can't we just think about investment as it is at the moment? Why can't we think about it as the financial markets as they exist at the moment? Why can't we tweak those a little bit with a few government or policy initiatives and get back to what we want? And I think the purpose is because we have forgotten that critical aim of investment as a process of commitment to the future. And that's, I think, is where the starting point for rethinking the virtue and the value of the fund in the world has to begin from. It has to look at where that commitment is needed. It has to look at the resources that need to be protected through that commitment. It has to look at that both in terms of natural resources and in terms of social resources, and also, of course, in terms of financial and monetary stability, which still is going to matter. And that, I suppose I'll just leave it with that last challenge, because it's the challenge that I've taken up particularly in our research group and in the research work that we're doing, which is that if we are, for whatever reason, headed into a post-growth world, we desperately need an economics of that world. We need to know about macroeconomic stability. We need to know about equity in that world, equality in that world. We need to know how financial markets work in that world. We need to devise mechanisms that actually will fund the kinds of social sustainability, the kinds of prosperity that I've been talking about. We need to know what a monetary fund looks like when prosperity is conceived not as endless growth or even as wealth, but as health. And that process is a process where we have to pay more attention to balance than we have done in the past, because health, as opposed to wealth, is not about accumulation. It's about finding the place where you are neither in deficiency nor in excess and can create the balance that will lead to stability into the future.
That is very, very clear and very insightful. Let me now introduce Professor Simon Johnson, who is a Ronald Coase Professor of Entrepreneurship at the MIT's Sloan School of Management and a member of Fannie Mae's Board of Directors. He was IMF's chief economist and director of its research department in 2007-2008, just the time when the crisis was starting to broom and build up. His 2010 best-selling book, 13 Bankers, The Wall Street Takeover, and the Next Financial Meltdown with James Kwok, is one of the most highly regarded books on the global financial crisis. For his articulate and outspoken support for public policies to end Too Big to Fail, Johnson was named a Main Street hero by the Independent Community Bankers of America. Simon, I would like to pass the baton to you to give us your views of Tim's work and this idea that we need to build economics for a world that is post-growth, and what is the role of financial markets, and how do you see, maybe you can also give us some reflections about your experience at the fund and how you leave those years that were years certainly of the super cycle and a bubbly behavior and endless aspirations. We'd like to hear your view now. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicoletta. Thanks, Prakash, for inviting me today, and thanks, Tim, for the book, which I highly recommend to everybody here. Really, really good read. Makes you very thought-provoking. I'm going to make you blush a little bit here, Tim. Reminded me of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which was written 60 years ago. Rachel's book is extremely poetic. It really makes you think deeply about the underlying problems. Rachel's book also, for those of you who haven't read it or haven't read it recently, is really a very clever policy book, because she proposes implicitly and explicitly some policy levers that could be pulled, including with regard to pesticides, DDT, obviously regulation of chemicals, but also I think she has a very devastating critique of government policies towards agriculture, which were at the foundation of a lot of the overuse of chemicals at that time. And of course, from that environmental movement, which Rachel helped to spark in the 1960s, we got the Environmental Protection Agency and a lot of rethinking, a new vision, I would say, Tim, of the environment, environmental policies. And I hope that is what your work, this book and the other work that you're involved in will also prompt. I do think vision, Tim, is central to your book, and that's good. That's exactly how it should be. We need you to give us this vision to help us imagine what these alternatives, okay, a little bit what they could have been, but more importantly, what they should be now and what they could be going forward. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, I'm just going to focus on the very practicality of things. This is the den of the IMF, but let me remind everyone there are some very friendly or non-threatening animals that live in dens, including, I just looked this up, chipmunks. So let's say we're in a den of chipmunks, and they will listen to you, but we need to be very concrete and very actionable. I mean, that's the number one thing that IMF, I think, really is all about to good effect. And I do think one piece, Tim, that you didn't emphasize, at least, I mean, I've read quite a few of your other papers as well, and I do think it's not so much in the book. I guess that's because it's written for the mom audience, which is a very smart idea. Oh, Kim Stanley Robinson. You also remind me of Kim Stanley, if you're familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson, Tim. I think it's that same sort of evocative. That's why I said you should write ecological thriller next, so we can actually compare more directly your style. But I do like, the IMF cares a lot about data and statistics, and the IMF is also the custodian of the international comparative macro numbers of any kind, which they go through periodic revisions. I'm sure Prakash and Nicoletta can tell us where we are in the whole cycle of revisions. I do think, and this is addressed to the Independent Evaluation Office more broadly, but looking at some version or multiple versions of the genuine progress indicator that Tim has. I'm looking at a paper from February 2020 called Wellbeing Matters, Tackling Growth Dependency. I do think that's really interesting, Tim, to pass that out and say, okay, what there is conceptually, again, the prosperity and growth are not the same thing. They may be correlated at low incomes. That's a good point. That seems quite plausible, and less as we become richer. But what numbers can we actually get into? What can the IMF look at? And be careful also, because if you go too far in some directions, certain levels of the IMF will say, well, that's the World Bank's job. Now, I think if it comes to data and comparative data, I'd rather have the IMF be in charge personally, as we're in the friendly den here. But just think about what the IEO and others could push for, what could be measured, what could be included, because once we measure it, I think, Tim, it becomes a lot easier to make that the focal point of G7, G20, and whatever discussion. So that's the main point there. I think on the policy side, look, obviously, you make a lot of really good points about the history, and I don't disagree that this, the sort of blind pursuit of growth, irrespective of the side effects and the costs and the risks, let's say, to the financial sector or to society or to the planet. That was part of what led us to the disaster of 2007, 2008. And I think, we have also been, frankly, insufficiently cautious about public health in many countries, and that's part of what made the pandemic so dramatically bad. I'm not sure we could have avoided some costs, but clearly in the United States, we spend 18% of GDP on healthcare. We were not prepared at all, not just ex ante, but for 9 months. We after the pandemic, yet we still weren't prepared. So again, if there are ways to measure that could be helpful. But let's talk about policy right now in the US, Tim, because I have plenty of friends in the Biden administration and trying to help them. And I worked on the Biden-Harris transition on various aspects in November, December, and January. I think that arguing for less growth or greener growth, you'll get a resonance on that message. But remember, there are a lot of people in this country, and also as far as I can see in the UK, who, some of the ones in the UK may actually still be in power, who will rally against that message. And if we, you need something that's sustainable politically, something that builds support, and something that people can rally around. I think investing in the future, real investments in science to improve people's lives, science to improve the lives of people near the bottom of society. I think you're right, the pandemic has helped get those messages across. I hope we can sustain that. Raising the incomes of people at the lower end, the caregivers, as you say, that's a big issue here. Childcare workers, workers in nursing homes, workers in all kinds of elder care situations. We have to find the revenue to do that. We have to find something sustainable in terms of revenue. Now, if you tell me that I should aim to do that while not hoping for or aiming to try and get growth, sure, we can try that. It's easier when the pie is growing, obviously, and it's much easier politically to sell to people when the pie is perceived as having the potential to grow. Not blowing up the planet, not destroying the planet, not consuming so much of the resources that we destroy the planet, not building the kind of crazy energy systems that caused the catastrophe in Texas recently. I think those are really good points, and I think this is why we need your vision, Tim, to tie these things together and convince people that there are other priorities, and then measure them and make those into goals. But I think there is still some work to be done in terms of convincing people that political coalitions are sustainable in these low growth scenarios. Very interesting to learn more about the economics of low growth futures. I do think when the IMF was first envisaged, there was not an assumption that growth would be robust and sustained. And I'm sure that the post-war growth boom was a massive upside surprise to anyone who was at Bretton Woods, for example. But I think you're right. We have forgotten that. We have become accustomed to it. We do think it's growth above all, irrespective of the side effects, the consequences, the risks that we're taking. So you're right to pull us over and give us a stern warning on that. But what should the Biden administration do? What exactly should either be in their proposals that's not there, or what should they dial back on? I think I'm very serious about this, Tim. I think we're open my friends are open to all kinds of practical ideas, but you have to. I'm sure you do understand, and the political context matters, and this is a very fragile moment. There are people out there who were in power until recently who, would burn your books if they could, or burn the Kindles, or whatever it is they would do, the modern version. So there's still a case to be, there's a lot of persuasion to be done, Tim. So thank you for doing what you have done, what you are doing. I think it's super helpful. But I think the business of the IMF is trying to turn that into practicalities at some level. But a lot of this is also about the IMF's pay grade, to be fair to them, Tim. A lot of this is at the level of G7, G20, ministers of finance, prime ministers, presidents. I mean, this is super serious stuff. And I think the IMF will be and can be, I'm sure, helpful. But I wouldn't expect the IMF to be able to initiate too much of the deep change that you're looking for here. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And Tim, do you want to, before I go on to Prakash, would you like to react to this? I think is enough.
Sure.
What Simon said, yeah.
Yeah, I'll do it very briefly because I'd like to hear what Prakash has to say. Obviously, thank you for your comments. I mean, I'm kind of interested in a way in asking you a question. I mean, a couple of things, I suppose. Most obviously, we've talked about the mandate, and the mandate obviously is a political mandate, and it isn't within your grasp necessarily, but it is something in which you have at least some input in defining that mandate. And so it does seem to me that there's a potential sort of bootstrapping, if you like, that could be done. And I've watched this happen. I've watched it happen with central banks. I've had conversations over the last decade with central banks, and I've gone into central banks and they sort of said, no, sorry, this is not our pay grade. This is our mandate. Our mandate is financial stability and inflation rates, and that's all. And actually, that's changed, and it's changed very recently. It's changed because it's become more obvious. It's changed because of the leadership of a few individuals, but it's now recognized that actually, if your central bank doesn't have a mandate that includes the protection of the climate, then you don't have the financial means as a country to organize your financial markets, your investment, your fiscal positions in a way that will protect yourself in the long run through the climate. So I do think that point about the mandate is a particular, it is something that from within you could become a voice that was, if you like, creating the mandate that you would like to have as an institution in the world. And of course, that's a political task. I don't underestimate the difficulty of that politically at all. But I think it is at least a starting point for sort of saying the IMF is not always going to be the same IMF that it is at the moment. And it doesn't need to be the IMF that it has been for the last 50 years. So that would be one point. I mean, and I think on the measurement point, I think you're absolutely spot on. I mean, quite a lot of our work is about measurement, and I think one of the papers that you cited where we talked about the GPI, one of the things, the genuine progress indicator, it's something I worked on over a period of 10-15 years back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and it is a way of thinking differently and measuring differently what your progress is. And just to take a very simple example of that, you can, for example, find methodologies that will measure the financial and monetary implications of having an unequal distribution of income. And I'm thinking in particular of Tony Atkinson, the late Tony Atkinson's index, which does that, does it in a way that's flexible, does it in a way that's democratic, does it in a way that can begin to tell you what the real welfare difference is when you have vastly unequal incomes in society. And actually the exercise that we did for the UK kind of showed that actually, it's about 25% of your income that's lost by having the kind of distribution of income that we actually have in the UK. And that, in other words, would tell you that actually we could be growing less if that income were more equally distributed. So these measures, and I agree absolutely with that point, that measurement tells you things, it allows you a way in, it allows you to address the issues, it gives you political purchase. The questions about what you say to Biden at this point, that's a tricky one, and I'm not sure that I really want to kind of risk my neck too much of it. But I do think he could do worse than appointing, AOC and Stephanie Kelton to the Council of Economic Advisors, because there are some solutions out there. And one question, I suppose, is what's you talked about vision versus measurement, and it's interesting for me to ask what, in your view, is the balance between those two things? Because I think, in a way, I guess I'm trying to do each of those things in the two books, in a sense. So Prosperity Without Growth was much more about the measurement, about the policy, about the implementation. Post-growth was much more about the vision. And in my mind, both of those things are important, but obviously, the kind of balance of effort within any individual institution can vary quite widely as to what it's doing.
I would like to move to Prakash. One reaction I have about the Simon point about the political economy of this, not just in the US, in general, is that I find there's a correlation between the people that are, are, I guess, resistant to a proposition where you have a lesser growth target, and those who also, think that we can green growth out, or so it's all the same people who say, we can grow, and then they were often they're the ones that use the resources as well, and I'm not sure how sustainable that proposition is in the long run. We just cannot square the circle. I'd like to hear Prakash Loungani on this now.
I think Simon wanted to come in. I saw him wave. Was that?
Sorry, I didn't. Sorry, I was moving my.
Just a very tiny point for Tim. So fair enough on pressing people at the micro individual level. I think that's quite reasonable, Tim. The Securities and Exchange Commission, I think under Gary Gensler, now the new chair, my former colleague at MIT, is, based on their public statements, heading in this direction. But I think where they've got to is internalizing the idea that the climate risk is significant and should be disclosed. But I have not seen anything, even I haven't heard this from the advocates, and I've talked to a lot of them, Tim, who say this should be done in a zero growth or post-growth framework. So that's an interesting, that may not satisfy you. I'm just sort of giving you a readout of where they are. And we'll see how much good disclosure does from the SEC. But you're quite right. And I think it's a very good point that central banks have changed their thinking a lot over 10 years. I'm really surprised and amazed by that. So congratulations to everyone who worked on that. And that will trigger, and I'm sure influence the IMF a great deal. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. So let's move to Prakash. Prakash, you all know him. Prakash Loungani is Assistant Director of the IMF's IEO. He's the co-author of the 2019 book, Confronting Inequality, How Societies Can Choose Inclusive Growth, with Jonathan Ostry and Andrew Berg, which documents how austerity and financial globalization contribute to inequality within countries. And Prakash is also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and is affiliated with the Just Jobs Network in Delhi and the Policy Center for the New South in Rabat. Prakash, can you offer us your overall views of Tim's work, the books, and maybe if you could, I know you worked on decoupling, between cyclical decoupling, and Tim touches upon the issue of absolute versus relative decoupling in the book, so the ability to grow without, hitting some of these boundaries. Maybe you can elaborate on that as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Nicoletta. Thanks very much for coming, Tim, and Simon as well. I had similar reactions to Simon's on the book. I was aware of Tim's work, but I had not actually sat down and read Prosperity Without Growth, which was the 2017 book, I think. And then on the Kindle, I also read the new book. And I think just reading those two back to back in 48 hours, I just found them really opened my mind. These are books that will feed your mind and your heart and your soul. They're written so well. There's the post growth is so poetic that you realize how constricted and constrained our minds have become when we just are thinking in sort of a narrow way, which our job forces us to do. We get good at our jobs by specializing, but these books really sort of open up your mind. So thanks very much, Tim. It was really a pleasure to read them. If you have time, I know we are trying to avoid the tyranny of PowerPoint, but if we have time later, I would like to come back to this figure 2 as an example of how your mind is opened by a simple chart. But maybe we can come back to that if there is time. But I want to pick up on this issue of decoupling between incomes and emissions. And frankly, I sort of started doing this work because just as a way of educating myself, and because I got a bit frustrated at hearing all these discussions of limits and non-linearities and tipping points and apocalypse is around the corner. So just as a way of educating myself, I sort of looked at, with several co-authors, the relationship between trend income and trend emissions, as well as cyclical growth and cyclical emissions. And I think when you just do what any sort of macroeconomist at the fund would do, just a simple trend cycle decomposition, for advanced economies, I mean, the news on decoupling seems somewhat good. I mean, in the US, for instance, since 2005, emissions have been on a decline in a trend sense. So there's a lot of cyclical noise, but when I just as a kind of a lay macroeconomist just looked at the data, it seemed to me that I was seeing just good news. But when I tried to engage with more environmental economists or ecological economists, I got sort of two messages. One is, well, you don't really understand that these things will hit limits, and which are the kind of thing that Tim was describing. And the other reaction I got was, well, I think you're actually right. There's a lot of good news, but if we go out and say it, people will get complacent. So I had many people take me aside and say, look, you don't really want to spread this message too much. So I guess my first hope would be to get some kind of reaction from Tim. I found it frustrating, the lack of interaction between, say, people like myself who are mainstream macroeconomists and people who are more well versed in the environmental and the ecological literature. Is there work that brings these two together, or am I exaggerating the trend improvement mere just by looking at what was happening in the trends without taking into account limits?
Thank you, Prakash, and thank you for the kind words about the books together. I mean, this question on decoupling is something that I've looked at quite a lot. I've looked at it over pretty much the 35 years of my career, starting out very much in a place which sort of said, well, we have these technologies, we know what they can do, we know that we got, I remember doing a study on 100% renewable energy future for Greenpeace back in 1988 or something. We know that these technologies exist and this decoupling is possible. And then you do, as you say, you look at actually at the trends, particularly in advanced economies over time, and you see that decoupling. I think that's absolutely clear. I don't dispute that. In many ways, in many countries, you can see that trend. You have to, I don't think it, to me, it's not about don't tell that good news, because I think we need all the good news we can get. And I don't think my story is a story that we don't need technology. It's not at all about that. It's not at all about, the advantages. It's not denying the advantages that technology brings, because again, all of that is going to be necessary to meet challenges such as the climate challenge and challenges that are even deeper than that, like the challenge in relation to biodiversity and our impacts on lands and the decline in soils and the pollution in the oceans and the decline of fish stocks and so on. We're going to need all of that. So to me, I guess, my response to that is not it's dangerous to tell the good news, but that it's dangerous to underestimate the extent of that challenge and assume that technology can fix it. You have to look at where the bounds of that technological progress can take us. And if you look at the advanced economies, you see that decline in carbon emissions, for example, on a territorial basis. Actually, as you say, quite fast, quite encouraging. Nothing like fast enough to meet the net zero challenge that we're facing, but at least you can see that it's possible. When you begin to look at that on a footprint basis, so looking at the supply chains that supply the produced goods, which are dirty manufacturing processes not in advanced economies, but are supplying consumption in advanced economies. When you look at it at that, the progress reduces massively, not entirely, but massively. So in a country like the UK, for example, we do have some decline on a footprint basis, but it's of the order of a few % decline in the carbon emissions per year, which is very, very different from the decline in territorial emissions, which is much, much faster. So you have to, and then if you look at the global level, actually we have not yet seen a decline in global carbon emissions, and that's the tricky point. So you have a leaky system with faulty indicators in which the only real number of importance is at the global level, where we have a good sense that actually those global carbon emissions have just about possibly maybe stabilized with the help of a global pandemic, and are not coming down anything like fast enough. And to me, that's where I would situate my answer to your very important challenge. How much can technology do for us? It can do a lot. It has to do a lot, but it can't do everything.
Thanks very much.
Prakash, would you like to have other questions? Like,
my other, yeah, but thanks very much for that answer, Tim. Just a side note on the cyclical relationship between income and emissions. I mean, we looked at that as well, and that's almost an iron law. I mean, we dubbed it the environmental Okun's law, because we found that in the past, at least, whenever the economy recovered, emissions recovered right back with it. So I'm not very optimistic that in the near term we're going to be able to sustain the decline we saw last year. It's going to boom back. So my second point is actually more of a comment, and I think touches a bit on what you and Simon were discussing about, what's the IMF's mandate? How much can the IMF help? Is it more a G20, G7 question? And Tim, your response that the mandate in part is what we, within reason, can choose to make of it. So I think the IMF's work in inequality, I think, offers a good sort of case study for how the IMF found a way to get involved in inequality. I mean, I was kind of a fly on the wall, so I observed this happening. But the managing director, the IMF's managing director, came back from Tunisia, having given it, a clean bill of health on every macroeconomic indicator that we could track. And then 2 weeks later, the place erupts, and soon after, you have the Arab Spring and cry against inequity. And so the IMF management said, well, wouldn't we make a statement saying inequality seems to be bad and it's making people unhappy and something should be done about it? And there was a lot of backlash within the building saying, no, inequality isn't part of our mandate. Our job isn't really to worry about people's happiness. We are, as Nicoletta was saying, an agency for external stability and financial stability. So, but then, clever people like Jonathan Ostry and Andy Berg remembered that they had a result sitting on the shelf. This was work they had done with Jerome and Zettelmeyer, which showed that higher inequality hurts sustained growth. By sustained, they meant durable in terms of time. And then suddenly this became fine for the IMF to talk about because sustained growth was what we were about. And so just finding a way to say, well, inequality hurts sustained growth became a mantra. Christine Lagarde repeated it in 20 speeches. And then all of a sudden you had a boom industry on inequality. And people started looking at the relationship between austerity and inequality. Using the word austerity became fine at the IMF. So to you, Simon, I think that's a bit of an example of how opportunities can be found to kind of define the mandate in a way that becomes acceptable and then kind of feeds on itself. And I think the central bank example is also a good one, Tim. The extent to which central banks have become involved in issues that were considered non-core is a good example. I remember a few years ago, I got an email from somebody at the Bank of England saying, would I agree to be on an advisory panel to have a conference on central banking and climate change. And because the email arrived on April 1st, I thought this was an April Fool's joke. And I just replied back, haha. And apparently this was serious. They said, no, we have a new governor, Mark Carney. He seems very serious about this. And would you really consider, because we want people with no prior positions to have an open mind about the role that central banks should play in climate change. And right now it's everyone, all central banks are rushing into this. So I think the mandate issue is important, but I think ways could be found for the IMF to be engaged in kind of a broader enterprise of the kind that Tim has been describing. So let me stop here, Nicoletta. I think there are some questions in the chat, so perhaps we should turn to that and give Tim the last 5 minutes to answer those questions.
Yes. There's a question by Dennis Egan. Would you like to put it yourself, or like me to read it, Dennis? Maybe I should read it. Question goes, can human nature, this is quite philosophical, can human nature be tamed to rid ourselves of hubris and accept the limits? What would the political economy look like? And can a truth teller win an election? And if yes, can she change things in a meaningful way without backlash and the risk of instability? I guess there's a lot of those answers can be extrapolated from the book, but go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, no, I mean, they're fantastic questions, and they were the kind of questions that motivated me to a lot, and particularly in post-growth. They're the kind of questions I've had a lot since the publication of Prosperity Without Growth, the ones that I wanted to delve into more deeply. I mean, I do think the question of the taming of human nature is a fascinating one, because it's a kind of assumption that is absolutely built into our economic models, into our sense of who we are as rational economic people, that we are selfish, hedonistic, and greedy, and that accumulation and the frontier is always where we are. That we're just, we live in a corner of the world. And I don't know if this is the graph that you were going to show, Prakash, but it's one that I find, really very telling. We live in the kind of corner of the human psyche, which characterizes human beings as being, selfish, novelty-seeking, hedonistic, greedy consumers, and it's wrong. I don't think so. So I don't think there is a brilliant, yeah, exactly, that's it. So we're kind of pushed by economics into this top right hand corner of the chart that Prakash has just kind of put, and he's written in there, let's get out of here. But what the other three quarters of that diagram shows is supported by psychology, it's supported by sociology, it's supported by wisdom traditions, it's supported by almost everybody except economists. And so in a sense, your question about taming human nature is actually about returning to a more rounded vision of who we are as people. And that's very much one of the projects in post-growth, was to if you like, to draw on traditions through the ages that position us, human beings, in a different perspective than that in which economics confronts us and pushes us, almost forces us into being. And that question of taming then becomes a more one of framing, because we have lost the frame that gives us the license to be fully human, and we've allowed economics to push us into an impossible position. And from there, I think, to some extent, I won't spend a lot of time on your other answers, but the political economy question is devastatingly important. I think it's one on which there's too little work, too little understanding, and is absolutely needed. And it's needed whether or not we think there's a dial somewhere that you go on and turn down growth on, which I don't personally believe. I don't believe that at all. It's needed because the political economy that we have and the social contract that we have has become so skewed by this idea of what progress means that in many cases it's not functional. So we do need that. We do need to think about that political economy. Can a visionary, progressive truth teller be elected? I think we've seen some countries where that can happen. Interesting that many of those countries, the leadership is by a woman rather than a man. And I don't personally believe that it's impossible either that we should see a man who would take that position, and I think to some extent Biden has, or that should be a place where they are constrained by the existing political economy. We know that the directions we're traveling are dysfunctional, and creating that vision for a different system and working systematically towards it in every category, in science, in technology, in the economy itself, in investment, in funding, in political economy, and in our sense of ourself, our vision is really, I think, the task that confronts us.
Simon, you had a short remark to make. Simon Johnson.
Bitcoin, Tim. You should speak, not necessarily right now, but about Bitcoin, because this is a really interesting example. What is Bitcoin? Well, I don't know if it's growth, I don't know if it's prosperity, but it sure as heck uses a lot of energy right now. And as the price of Bitcoin rises, we're bringing more coal-fired power stations back online. Now, this also happens to be within the purview of the IMF, because we're speaking about money and money-type assets and so on and so forth. So I think coming out with your views on Bitcoin would be quite worthwhile, Tim, and integrating that in as an example into your worldview would also be welcome.
It's interesting. I've recently begun to have a lot of conversation with my students about this. I'm not an expert on it. I see it I view it with a mixture of kind of some alarm, I would have to say, and a little bit of confusion, particularly in the way that many of those cryptocurrencies are currently operating. As you say, they're very energy intensive. They're also more or less pyramid schemes in one form or another. But I do think that the technology behind it, the blockchain ledger, is in fact a way of democratizing money that could turn out to be useful if it was placed in a platform that allowed it to create a regenerative economy. And I do even know of one or two examples of people who are trying to do that. So blockchain for good is a good place for some insights on that.
We are now hitting the 2:15 limit, but I have a couple of questions that I think are interesting, and then we can close. The first one is by Luigi Durand. It says the COVID crisis highlighted insufficient degree of resilience of our current economic systems in the face of global shocks, i.e. economic system based on global value supply chains. Does your post-growth economy framework address any of these fault lines? And if yes, how? And then there's one on by Steve Mugerwa. How can we get poor resource rich countries through net zero anxiety? And we'll close up this too. Can and wish.
So what was the second one? How can we?
It was how can we get poor resource rich countries through net zero anxiety? I guess it's talking about countries that have oil or other commodities but are not very developed, and now they find themselves that they can't even export that because we're transitioning to net zero.
Yeah, I mean that is potential.
There's also a question from Ita. Sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, no, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Okay, so maybe the last question. Thanks for a really interesting. This is a third question. Thanks for a really interesting discussion. The corporate sector, USWF seems to have agreed, the couple of press releases recently, that Milton Friedman's shareholder primacy may not be a sustainable model, as trickle down is now limited, as wealth begets more wealth in financial markets, with wealth divergence and incomes of the middle class stagnating. What are your views?
I missed just the first bit of that. There was a little bit of this interference, Nicoletta. Could you? It's the question.
That the corporate sector seems to have agreed that Milton Friedman's shareholder primacy may not be a sustainable model, as trickle down is now limited.
Yeah, I mean, on that one, I welcome that that idea that the corporate sector is kind of now disagreeing or departing a little bit from the business of business is business. I do think that's what we've learnt in a way, that we are dependent on each other, that we cannot think of business as independent from society, that if we pursue that route and we drive it through a lens that sees everybody as greedy and we will reward that greed, then we get exactly the kind of system that we have at the moment, and it's deeply dysfunctional. And just prior to the pandemic, it was really interesting to see, and I start the book with this anecdote, actually, the meeting in Davos, where actually, kind of one after the other, people lined up to sort of talk about the limitations of capitalism and the limitations of the shareholder model as it exists, and in particular to talk about the limitations of that the business of business is business philosophy, that is defunct, it is moribund, it is dysfunctional. And I think, a realization that that's the case is good. It doesn't necessarily end the task. The task doesn't end by recognizing that mentality is wrong. It actually starts at that point, and we have to think more deeply into that system, into the relationship that business should have with society, what enterprise should be in society, and how that contributes to social progress, and how it's supported by financial investment and financial structure. And those are all really hard tasks, but they are the basis for thinking about a post-growth society. On the poorer net, the anxiety of poorer resource-rich net zero towards net zero, I think that there is a really, really tricky case. We actually have some work at the moment looking at, in particular, at what is the situation in terms of stability between one region of the world that is moving towards a post-growth position, either by default or by design, and one which is still, broadly speaking, in a growth-based position because it has very poor people who need better lifestyles, and how they approach trade in that relationship. I think it's a really tricky issue, and I think what we have to bring to the table as the starting point for that analysis is that the conventional model that those countries can lift themselves out of poverty by vigorous export of unsustainable products has not worked. It isn't sufficient, in fact, to take forward as a model of the relationship between those countries. And therefore, in a sense, it is in our interest, as well as in the interests of those countries, to work with them towards a post-growth or a post-resource growth model that supports bringing the poorest people in the world out of poverty. And I guess I would say, in a way, to sort of finish, and it's to do not quite enough justice to the question of resilience that the first questioner asked, but it does sort of support that view, and it's a view that goes back to the lessons we learned from the pandemic, that what matters is health, what matters is the quality of people's lives, what matters is relationship. The hardest part of lockdown was not being able to go out shopping, but not being able to see our families. And that actually putting those priorities at the heart of the economic model that we build for the future is the task of today. It's the task that I believe we should take to Biden, to Johnson, to the EU, to the advanced economies, but we should also make accessible and available to the poorest countries in the world. There's a sense in which a society can only really be judged by the fate of the poorest in that society. And while we look at vast inequalities, while we look at degraded environments, while we look at places where health disintegrates, where we look at poor social care, where we look at old people who don't have enough support, where we look at our kids, the next generation, unable to get decent schooling, then we are in a position where we have to look at that and say we are not a prosperous society, and we have to devise the ways in which we work at that together. And it seems to me, that is a lesson which provides vision, which defines measurement, which can shape policy, and it is the focus for something which we could call a post-growth economy. We don't, in a post-growth economy, go to a dial in Treasury and turn down the rate of growth. We don't ever say that that's what we're doing or what our aim should be. What we do is focus on the things that matter. They are the things that matter. The first and only task of government, said Thomas Jefferson 200 years ago, is the care of human life and health, and not its destruction. And I think that's the basis for not just, Joe Biden, not just advanced economies, but for the poorest economies of the world and the institutions that serve them.
Tim, thank you so much for being with us today. Here, the book. I suggest you all to bungee jump into the reading, because honestly, the only way to grow, at least internally, is to challenge yourself, to challenge your mindset. And I tremendously enjoy these books. And I thank Tim for having written them, for going around, evangelizing with this very pragmatic, very solid, and very insightful vision of economics, actually, which is our profession. I would like to thank Simon for being with us, and the provoking and interesting question, the policy angles, and Prakash, of course, for the very interesting conversation about inequality and decoupling, and everybody else. See you at next occasion. Thank you.